Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. And if you haven't done it already, please hit the like button so this show shows up in the algorithm. It's going to be a spicy one tonight. And if you haven't done it, please hit the subscribe button. It helps us out quite a bit. And since time is of the essence, I'm not going to waste any time bringing in my co-host. Sadly, Pascal Robert will not be with us tonight. He has some family business to tend to. But in Pascal's place, I think I have found a suitable placement. You know him as the middle management of the Death Star and your favorite servant of the Deep State. It is Deep State Cuba. Give it up.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here.
Yes, someone asked if those are my riffs in the beginning. Yes, they are. That is me playing the guitar and the bass. No, I did not get a new camera. I just figured out how to work with my Mexican Wi-Fi. Cuba, are you ready for tonight?
Man, I don't know if I'm comfortable with being in Pascal's position because that sounds like a great way to get mau-mau'd. But I'll do my best to make up the deficit.
Well, you definitely added some good questions to this discussion tonight. I'm very excited to have our guest on. He actually had written an article. He's written several books, actually, definitely about empire. I don't know if it was his first book. We'll definitely ask him, but I know he wrote a book that got him into a little bit of trouble with your buddies in the deep state about the CIA and the heroin trade. So Alfred McCoy is definitely an OG when it comes to busting out the deep state. We made a bit of an intro video. The intro videos are back. Finally had some time to do that. Before we bring in our guest to get you guys primed and ready, check this out.
I'd like to know what any one of you knows about real food.
Lowell, what do you mean real food? What, out of the dirt? That's real food, isn't it?
That's right. This happens to be nature's greatest gift.
To a celibate, maybe. It wasn't good. Maybe he knows something we don't. Hey, Lowell, give me a slice of that cantaloupe, huh? Hey, don't ask Lowell for a slice. I'd be delighted to give you a slice of that cantaloupe.
Just sit down and shut up. Sit down, sit down, sit down! And shut up and leave me alone, all of you, now, and let me eat.
Hey, now, what's the big deal? I can't see the difference between that and this anyway.
You don't see the difference? The difference is that I grew it. That's what the difference is. That I picked it and I fixed it. And it has a taste and it has some color. And it has a smell. And that it calls back a time when there were flowers all over the earth. And there were valleys. And there were plains of tall green grass that you could lie down in, that you could go to sleep in. And there were blue skies, and there was fresh air, and there were things growing all over the place, not just in some domed enclosures blasted some millions of miles out into space. Look at that stuff. How can you guys sit there and really say anything to me about this? Look at this crap. Look at that. Dried synthetic crap. And you've become so dependent on it that I bet you can't even live without it.
In his latest book, To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change, historian Alfred McCoy explains how a succession of catastrophes from the devastating Black Death of 1350 through the coming climate crisis of 2050 has produced a relentless succession of rising empires and fading world orders. During the long centuries of Iberian and British imperial rule, the quest for new forms of energy led to the development of the colonial sugar plantation as a uniquely profitable kind of commerce. In a time when issues of race and social justice have arisen with pressing urgency, the book explains how the plantation's extraordinary profitability relied on a production system that literally worked slaves to death, creating an insatiable appetite for new captives that made the African slave trade a central feature of modern capitalism for over 4 centuries. After surveying past centuries roiled by imperial wars, national revolutions, and the struggle for human rights, McCoy seeks to prognosticate about the future, highlighting the ways in which climate change and changing world orders will shape the life opportunities for younger generations. What does this past tell us about the future of the global order? How and why is this order changed? And what will this mean for future generations? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution. All right, without any further ado, let's bring in our guests. Alfred William McCoy is an American historian and educator. McCoy is currently the Fred Harvey Harrington Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He specializes in the history of the Philippines, foreign policy of the United States, European colonization of Southeast Asia, illegal drug trade, and Central Intelligence Agency covert operations. He is the Alfred McCoy. Please give it up for Dr. McCoy. How are you this evening, sir?
Oh, fine, Justin. Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks
Thanks for being here. I always get a little nervous when you have guests of certain calibers. Sometimes they just don't show, so I got nervous. And if you would have saw me running around here like a madman, you'd be cracking up right now, because I was very, very at ease when you returned. Oh, don't worry, I'll be there in 5 minutes. So thank you very much for showing up. Now, I want to start off. I didn't even know you had a book out. I had found an article that you had written about being in the Philippines during a coup in 1986, being at the hotel bar. And you write in that piece, as an eyewitness, I can recall the events of January 6th in Washington as if they were yesterday. The crowds of angry loyalists storming the building while overwhelmed security guards gave way. The slavishly loyal vice president who would, the president hoped, restore him to power. The crush of media that seemed confused, almost overwhelmed by the crowd's fury. The waiter who announced that the bar had run out of drinks and would soon be closing. Hold it. My memory's playing tricks on me again. That wasn't the U.S. Capitol in January 2021. That was the Manila Hotel in the Philippines of July 1986. Still, the two events had enough similarities that perhaps I could be forgiven for mixing them up. Now, what is similar about 1986 in the Philippines and January 6th in Washington?
Well, in both cases, you had a former president, Ferdinand Marcos, had been overthrown in the massive people power revolution in the Philippines in February 1986, in which 1 million Filipinos massed in the streets of Manila and drove him into exile in Hawaii. And then a parallel between soon-to-be ex-president Donald Trump inspiring his supporters to rally in Washington, D.C., and then to storm the U.S. Capitol. So, the parallel between ex-presidents, a crowd of fanatically loyal supporters the storming of a symbol of national pride, the U.S. Capitol, the Manila Hotel, which is a very historic building in the Philippines, and the fervor surrounding it, the attempt to regain power. But the other thing that I learned from witnessing that event in the Philippines back in 1986 was that coup initially seemed sort of a joke, even more of a joke than the shaman with the buffalo headdress and all the Confederate flags and all the rest of that in the U.S. Capitol. But very quickly things got very, very serious. A year later, I was back in Manila, and I found myself standing in the middle of an 8-lane concrete highway, watching as government forces were trying to overthrow a second coup attempt by those same rebels. Because those rebels looked at that kind of joke coup at the Manila Hotel, and they realized that overthrowing a government when you're inside the military is actually rather easy. And so they made a serious attempt a year later, and that wound up taking the Philippine Marines to actually breach their own military cantonment. The rebels burned the headquarters of the Philippine Armed Forces, and a couple of years after that, they tried again, and that time they got very close to taking the presidential palace in the Philippines. President George H.W. Bush was en route to a summit with the Soviets in Malta, flying over the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and he got a call that Manila was about to fall to rebels, and he ordered the U.S. Air Force to make low passes over the rebels who were about to take the presidential palace in the Philippines. So the meaning of all this is that even a seemingly absurd coup can have a profoundly corrosive impact on a democracy and produce a kind of inspiration, an attempt to try again. And I think there's every sign that the Republican Party is very much committed to gaining power in the next presidential election by fair means and foul. They've learned that extraordinary actions work. You can get away with even storming the U.S. Capitol and threatening the fundamental institutions of American democracy. In other words, you can do anything and get away with it.
And you write in your piece about de Gaulle in France and the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, explaining to us, the reader, that the coup isn't just a one-time event. Like you said, these things lay in wake for years, sometimes promoting people of this fascist faction into political power, like you write about Le Pen in France. What do you think? You also talk about a lot of the punishments that were given out in the Philippines, and you compared them to some of the light sentences that were given out to January 6th. What do you think is the proper response to people that want to be the insurrectionists?
Well, if it's a military and they rebel against the state, they turn their arsenal, their weapons of mass destruction against the state. Traditionally, the penalty is death by firing squad. Mm-hmm. For civilians who attempt, protracted prison sentences. In the case of the Philippines, in the aftermath of the coup, and there were several hundred soldiers that rebelled, and they flooded into the Manila Hotel, along with Marcos's fanatical loyalist supporters. Those hundreds of soldiers were sentenced to 30 push-ups. It was a part of the sort of joke atmosphere that surrounded that coup. But you mentioned another aspect of the January 6th coup that links it to the topic of my book, To Govern the Globe, the topic of empire and world orders. One of the things that struck me in doing that article about the January 6th coup and its comparison with the Philippines, and it's something that I'm surprised that most people haven't remarked upon. In the modern era, almost every single power that loses an empire, it doesn't simply, liquidate a property holding in a kind of rational manner, like, colonialism didn't quite work out, so we move on. No, it goes to the core of national identity. It is a body blow to the national psyche, and it reverberates profoundly, deeply inside the metropolitan society that's losing its empire. And so almost every modern empire that has fallen has been accompanied by a serious attempt to conduct a coup and to overthrow the constitutional order that presided over the empire at the time. So let's, Italy in the 1920s had a coup that brought Mussolini and the fascists to power for 20 years. When France lost the Indochina War and then left Algeria in defeat, that prompted a serious coup that by the French military. They rebelled against the French state. They killed something like 12,000 people. There were terrorist bombings and 3 assassination attempts on President Charles de Gaulle that came within an inch. And the French state finally broke that coup. Spain suffered a protracted loss of empire that culminated in the revolt by Francisco Franco against the Spanish Republic and brought fascism to power in Spain for 40 years. Even the United Kingdom, a relatively stable democracy, had 2 abortive coup attempts after its decolonization. And the Soviet Union, as it gave up its empire in Eastern Europe, suffered a serious coup that attempted to overthrow Gorbachev and ultimately led to his eclipse of power and the final dissolution of the Soviet Union. So it's very, very common. Happened to Portugal as well. The Carnation Revolution in Spain was a result of the trauma of Portugal's decolonization. And I think the January 6th coup in Washington, D.C. was a manifestation of that same crisis of empire for the United States, because the January 6th coup of this year was followed in August by, of course, the U.S. defeat and withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is a major sign of waning U.S. global power, or the U.S. loss of its position as the great global hegemon. And so as our power overseas wanes and we suffer those kinds of body blows to our national psyche and pride, our domestic democracy grows less stable, and events like January 6th, which in America seemed almost unimaginable before it happened. I mean, when you think about it, we've never had anything like this since the Civil War.
Also, I hasten to point out that it was, if it was a coup attempt, it was unsuccessful. And I think that many of the participants themselves didn't even imagine themselves to be participating in a coup. They enter the Capitol, they take control, and they take selfies. They don't have an idea about what to do with this access that they've gained, and they end up just milling around and leaving. But I think that your point is that initial types of actions against the constitutional order may seem carnivalesque, may be easy to sort of dismiss precisely because of this buffoonish atmosphere and their failure. But potentially, it remains to be seen whether this is the trajectory the United States is on. But potentially, this is a harbinger of more serious efforts by better prepared and more determined actors to overturn the constitutional order.
I think most people have a sort of, if they think about coups at all, they may have a false idea that because they're often run by military who are supposed to be planning their operations, there's a general assumption that coups are carefully planned down to the last minute. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, I just got a notice saying the host is muted your mic. Okay. Anyway, so there's an assumption that because these are military guys and they're supposed to be, very precise and organized in their operations, that they plan everything down to the last minute. Well, actually, maybe so on the battlefield, but when they enter the political arena, in which they're very unfamiliar, they more or less opt for like a symbolic action. Mass the troops, strike a symbolic blow, and then see how things are going to play out. In other words, like strike at the constitutional order through one of its symbols, and then go with the flow. all right?
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of abortive coups. There are many more failed coups than there are successful ones. So one shouldn't confuse the kind of ad hoc plan of Trump, call the supporters to Washington, D.C., send them down the street, and then kind of see what happens. So, again, very serious consequences can come from seemingly ill-planned operations.
Someone in the chat asks, and thank you for the super chat, JB. If we're going to talk the language of coups and contact U.S., can we please discuss 2000 election and Bush v. Gore? That was a coup.
Um,
I'm actually pretty sympathetic to that interpretation. The coups don't have to be executed by military people, and if looking at 2000 in retrospect, one element of the ruling elite inside the Republican Party mobilized its resources in order to use what now gets called lawfare, because other people do it too, and exploit their influence inside the legal system and exploit the ambiguities, the sort of institutional inefficiencies of American elections to, decisively determine the outcome of the election without going through the steps as specified in, constitutional rules, whether in the state of Florida or on the national level. So I think, and one thing that you mentioned as well is that before you get to the coups, there's a long time coming. There's a lot of institutional hollowing out, a weakening of norms, more and more predatory behavior by elites who begin to, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that's the process that I see taking place in the United States, and it begins long before January 6th.
Without getting into all the details, I guess I would say perhaps, no doubt the long lead up, okay, all the pressures, as you put it, the elites deciding that they're going to take extra systemic steps, extra legal steps in order to affect their influence, sure. But when it comes to coup-like behavior, coup-like activity, January 6th is another step. For one, the President of the United States is sending a mob into the U.S. Capitol. So it's taking place at the epicenter of power, and it's being organized by the most powerful figure in American politics to overturn one of the absolute essentials of democracy. In fact, arguably the essential attribute of electoral democracy, which is the transfer of power via the ballot box. Okay, let's attempt to short circuit that. Second thing is the involvement of the military. Okay, the U.S. military had ample resources to protect the Capitol, right? And that's another thing that I learned by watching that Philippine coup in 1986, that seemingly silly, almost comedic coup, is that it's slowing the response of the military forces, all right, for just enough time to allow these events to play out. And that's what the Trump administration was doing. And when you study coups, you often look for linkages, patterns, ties, sort of personal ties among actors. And one of the critical ties was Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, actually went to the White House in the aftermath of the November election and recommended that Trump act extralegally, declare martial law, use the military to seize power and keep himself in office. And on January 6th, when the DC mayor's office, the District of Columbia mayor's office, was desperately calling the Pentagon and asking for the mobilization of the National Guard, all right? One of the men on that phone call inside the Pentagon who said no was Lieutenant General Charles Flynn, who is the brother of Michael Flynn.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and so what is surprising, okay, is think about all of the people being summoned, they're being subpoenaed, and all the discussions. Nobody is talking about this. Nobody's talking about it because it's very sensitive, and it's absolutely critical. The Pentagon has admitted that yes, Charles Flynn was on the phone call that said no to mobilizing the National Guard, to stop this event. Okay, so that's what I mean about, all Charles Flynn had to do was just give the coup plotters a little bit of time to see how it rolled, to see how it played out, whether they got Pence, whether they grabbed Pence and made him, declare Donald Trump the winner, something, okay, something, and I think it's a critical failure of the congressional resolution.
So just to follow up on your observation about Charles Flynn, one of the things that I've sort of seen as part of the erosion of governability and political stability, order in the United States domestically, is the culture of impunity around elites. Whether you see it especially in terms of financial crimes and Wall Street, like in the aftermath of 2008 financial crisis, the refusal to hold anyone accountable. But do you find that kind of has the rule of law, the applicability of law to people like Charles Flynn, that we're at a point where things like using force to challenge the political order is now, like you said, punishable by push-ups?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's look at Michael Flynn. Okay, he was a former national security advisor. He was a very high-ranking general, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency in his day. He's one of our most senior military commanders. The fact that you have an individual who's at the apex of the national security apparatus, actually, even though retired, recommending to President Trump a declaration of martial law. How could I put it? He should be investigated. He should probably be stripped of his pension. He's by recommending that, he has, committed a very serious crime. And so that's what I mean. When you talk about impunity, the people that are most likely in transnational, okay, in the collapse of dictatorships around the world, and the justice and accounting for the excesses of dictatorships in Latin America and Africa and Europe, the people that usually escaped were those in the national security apparatus, ex-military and military, that are engaged in crimes against humanity. Very rarely prosecuted because they have, very close, powerful ties within the national security establishment, which, after all, has a monopoly on the weapons of mass destruction. And still, states are very loath to punish those people. And those are the ones that get impunity in these circumstances. And so, the Flynns will get away with it.
And, shifting gears, back to the book, To Govern the Globe, out now on Haymarket Books. You speak of not just empires that come and go, but more importantly, world orders. Can you define what you mean when you talk about world orders?
Sure. In the past 500 years, there have been 90 empires, large and small, that have come and gone. But there only have been 3 and now maybe 4 world orders. The Iberian, which is Spanish and Portuguese, which lasted roughly from 1500 to 1800. Then there was the British Imperial Order, which lasted from 1815 to 1914. And the Napoleonic Wars, the start of World War I. And then since the end of World War II in 1945, the American or Washington World Order, which is the system we're living in today. And now we're seeing, as a result of all these tensions that we've been talking about, that abortive coup and the like, a waning of U.S. global hegemony and sometime around 2030, a fading of Washington's world order and its replacement by a decidedly illiberal world order, the Beijing global system. So, what's the difference between an empire and a world order? Well, an empire, we pretty much have a clear idea. It's essentially through formal and informal means, the exercise of control over states and territories beyond your own borders. Okay, and some empires have had one state, like one colony, like the Belgian Congo or the Netherlands East Indies, which is now called Indonesia. It's tiny little Poland had massive Indonesia as its colony. Okay, so so we know what empires are, but world orders is something that most people aren't aware of. Indeed, the literature is not aware of. World orders are less coherent. They're less powerful on the surface than empires, but in many ways they're much more pervasive and much more persistent. World orders govern the languages people speak, oftentimes the way they worship, the laws they follow, and even the games they play. So they're akin to entire civilizations. So one of the attributes of America's global hegemony was it not only emerged from World War II as the most powerful empire that ever existed, with 50% of the world's economy, a preponderance of its military power, and a global reach. But the United States also very self-consciously at the end of World War II set out to construct a new kind of international order, a world order. And it did that in Bretton Woods, which created the international economy that we live in today, set up the exchange rates, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, promoted trade, and then it created what is now the World Trade Organization. So basically, it organized the international trade system today. And then at the UN, at the UN conference in San Francisco in 1945, the U.S. and 50 other sovereign states got together and created the international community. And undergirding both the Bretton Woods system of economic exchange and the United Nations was the ultimate American project at a world order, the rule of law. All of these international organizations, all of this trade is girded with incredibly elaborate contracts, regulations, and treaties, which are basically contracts among nations. It's a highly legalistic system. And aside from the structure of the international order, it's had two key principles. One, as manifest in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, essentially drafted as the first chair of the UN Human Rights Commission. So all human beings have universal human rights. Colonization, conquest, subjugation on the basis of race and religion no longer allowed. And second, not only did every human being have human rights as an individual, but they and their communities, their national community, had the right to be members of a sovereign state that had inviolable sovereignty. And so that was the U.S. world order. And it's generally been called a kind of liberal world order because of those principles. And it's actually
liberal democracy is what you call it.
Democracy isn't formally a part of it, but as you know, in the U.S. exercise of hegemony has been softened by two key attributes of U.S. relations on a formal level. One, the idea of economic development, helping nations progress and uplifting people from poverty, and the promotion of democracy. These are the two.
If I may, because you're very forthright in admitting that the United States, as hegemon, is constantly falling short of the liberal world order that it established. That the United States helps midwife the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but is now one of the great violators of what we consider what any sane person would take a fair reading of that same declaration. The United States hasn't shut down Guantanamo. The abuses of Abu Ghraib are still fresh. violations, invasions, territorial acquisition, or violations of the territorial sovereignty of other states have actually been routine elements of American foreign policy ever since the ink was dry on the UN documents. So I think that you admit to a lot of the crimes and the failures of the United States, a lot of the transgressions against the values that it promulgated, or the values that are embedded in this world order, at least formally and rhetorically. So one question that I think would really interest our viewers is, what is the distinction? What's the meaningful distinction between a hegemon like the United States, which might have authored progressive world order at one point, generations ago at this stage, but routinely violates it, shreds it without any hesitancy? And not only that, but undermines efforts by other powers to live up to those obligations. And China, which behaves essentially the same way, just with less pretense to observing human rights.
Right. Good question. Good observation. It's something I discussed in my book, Governing the Globe, in great detail. One thing I say is that every world order operates with a duality of power and principle. At the principle side, the U.S. turned its ideals and emerging international ideals into this world order, and all the treaties, conventions, the international court cases, all of that, it gives real life and institutional coherence and vitality to this world order that is found in these two principles: universal human rights and inviolable national sovereignty. Having established that order and played an absolutely key role in its establishment, the United States, right from the start, as it was exercising its global power, set out to violate the same principles that it was establishing almost at the time that it was establishing those principles. So let's take the CIA. The United States is creating the UN in 1945. Eleanor Roosevelt is getting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights introduced in 1948. Right in the middle there, 1947, the U.S. establishes the CIA, and it gives it the authority, the legal authority in its chart, in the legislation that founded the CIA, to operate extra-legally. And so how does a great global hegemon violate systematically and regularly the national sovereignty of other states, oftentimes very poor, weak states, and not be seen to be shredding this international order, violating this principle of inviolable sovereignty? Well, the answer is you do it covertly. And that's the whole need for the CIA. It resolved this contradiction between the principle of inviolable sovereignty and the global hegemon's need to intervene, okay? The same thing with torture, and I've spent a lot of time. I spent 20 years of my life thinking and writing about torture, about 3 books. Spent a lot of time in interviewing victims and perpetrators, trying to figure out torture. And again, more than any other single violation of human rights, except probably slavery, which is formally abolished, but you know, in the modern world, the ultimate violation of the principles of human rights is torture. And at the same time that the United States was enshrining the prohibition on torture in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Geneva Conventions, it was simultaneously developing the very sophisticated techniques of psychological torture, which throughout the 40 years of the Cold War, it propagated among its allies worldwide. And indeed, after 9/11, you know, we didn't just outsource them to Latin American dictatorships. We had CIA operatives actually engaging and using those very sophisticated
openly as well, no longer covertly.
Yeah.
Guantanamo Bay.
Well, it was done covertly. I mean, it is in the military courts in Guantanamo up to now, okay, until very recently, you couldn't discuss those techniques. They were shrouded in national security. So yeah, it was done covertly.
Although when
And
Dick
even
Cheney
today,
appears on television,
we do not know the names of any of those CIA torturers. All right, I mean they've never been named, and they never will be named. All right, it's just they have impunity.
Cuba has
but
to pretend like he doesn't know the names, but he knows the names.
George, all right, come on, man. But the Dick Cheney, already after September 11th, this was the classic covert language was if you're caught doing any of this, any of these illegal activities for the United States, although we've authorized them, you will be disavowed. But one development after September 11th was that up to the level of the presidency, you had American public officials defending things like Guantanamo Bay, and in the case of Dick Cheney, doing it with obvious public relish.
Another of the manifestations of imperial decline, not only these sort of shock waves that reverberate through the imperial society and produce the coups that we've described. Okay, but another thing that is these empires their power gets shaky and they get desperate to cling to that power overseas. One of the things that almost every empire in decline does is a recourse to torture. The French did it systematically and ruthlessly in Algeria. The British did it in Northern Ireland, but actually did it worldwide. They did it in Aden, they did it in Kenya, and they did it most recently and controversially in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s. So, what these empires don't realize is that by engaging in what is now deemed to be the most inhumane of practices, they delegitimate their imperial enterprise. The French systematically engaged in torture in Algeria, and the French military, when they were picking up Algerians, they would torture them and then shoot them and dump the bodies in shallow graves in the desert outside the city of Algiers. But they also made the mistake of torturing a French colonial, a metropolitan French citizen, a man named Henri Alleg, and he wrote a book about it called The Question. Jean-Paul Sartre, very famous intellectual that day, wrote an introduction to it. It became a cause célèbre in France, and it critically turned the French public against the entire Algerian enterprise and made the liberation of Algeria politically not only possible but an imperative. And so that declining empires engage in this savagery, and then it discredits them. And the blow to American global hegemony from the Abu Ghraib scandal, the Guantanamo scandal, has been monumental. And indeed, just a month or so ago, 7 mid-ranking military officers who are serving in Guantanamo in the prosecution of the 9/11 terrorists, etc., they wrote a ringing letter that was published on the front page of the New York Times denouncing the CIA's torture techniques and saying they violated fundamentally American principles and they were something that had damaged the United States irreparably. And these are serving military officers who said that.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And I think that this gets back to the question of what the practical implication is of replacing a delegitimated hegemon like the United States, which in a lot of ways has been shredding the world order that it gave rise to through its unilateralism, through things like the public use of torture. What's the substantive difference between this debased world order under unapologetic, out of control metropolitan hegemon, the United States, versus what you describe as potentially a coming Beijing-based hegemony?
Good question. And I don't mean to be contentious, but let me say that I think you've conflated, put together two things, okay? One, the excesses that we've been discussing, the torture, the CIA covert interventions, all that, that's part of the US hegemony, the power side of the equation. The principle side of the equation, the universal human rights, the inviolable national sovereignty, okay, that's embedded in these international organizations. For example, we're not a member of the International Criminal Court, right? But it exists, and it's a very important organization. In many ways, it's the culmination of the entire U.S. promotion of the international rule of law, which
despite America's opposition to it.
Well, I mean, we introduced this into the international discussion in the 1890s, and we've been pushing it along consistently. You know, backing away from it as we did. We're not members of the Union. Okay, but so what I'm saying is that this apparatus is not just American. This is the culmination of 500 years of the most painful kind of history. All right. The massacres of the Amerindians in the Americas, the Middle Passage across the Atlantic with 12 million African slaves being introduced to the Americas to fill the demographic void from the massacre of the Amerindians. All right, and the debate. I mean, talking about duality. Okay, the Spanish Empire was arguably, in terms of its massacres and its practice of slavery, probably the most inhumane of all the empires and all the world orders. But simultaneously, with these great excesses, there were Spanish missionary friars who observed these great crimes, people like Bartolomé de las Casas and Antonio de Montesinos, and made, at the time, confronted Spanish officials with these crimes and gave the most emotional denunciations that when you read their language, you read the Advent sermon by Antonio de Montesinos in 1511 that he gave in the Dominican Republic. His denunciation, those words could be articulated by the most modern and the most committed of human rights activists. Okay, so the Spanish duality was great crimes and yet the discovery of the idea of universal human rights. And that unleashed a continuous debate, all right, that has gone through the centuries, that went to the Dutch and then the British and then us. We're the heirs to 5 centuries of this debate arising from these great crimes, all right? And we institutionalize that in these organizations. So it's apart from us. And so the question is, okay, U.S. hegemony, let me finish. U.S. hegemony is toast. We're done by 2030. We're gone. We can talk about how and why, but basically it's over. The power side of the U.S. equation is over. The real question is, will this liberal international order, which the United States helped create, which is the culmination of 5 centuries of history, will that survive?
And I wanted
I don't think it will. I think that's a tragedy. That Beijing replaces the United States as global hegemon, that's the way it goes, right? But that Beijing is going to systematically damage and degrade this liberal international order now, that's serious.
And I agree with you, and I would like to offer a different perspective. I concur that the liberal international order that you described and the notion of international human rights and an international rule of law, these are valuable contributions that have made the conduct of international politics less savage. You've pointed out to the Spanish Empire as being possibly the most brutal and inhumane episode of imperial aggression. And absolutely, the depopulation of Mexico, of Peru, of large parts of South America, and the brutal slavery and peonage of the colonial system, that the forced conversions, we're talking about atrocities, not to mention, of course, the introduction of the slave trade or their role in it, which was, of course, pioneered by another Catholic empire, the Portuguese. So they're monsters, but you point out there's this legacy of human rights international rule of law that gradually alters the way that interstate, international global affairs are conducted, and it reaches its highest form after World War II with the United Nations. It is midwifed by the United States, but at this point, I'd say that the European powers, some Asian countries, some countries in the global south, places like Uruguay, Chile, are arguably better exemplars and partners, better models of citizens within that world order. While the one on top, the hegemon, the current hegemon, the United States, especially under Donald Trump, but even prior to Donald Trump, we could go back to Bill Clinton, we could go back to George W. Bush, we could go back to whenever you want, has also been undermining and shredding that world system. It was a double-sided game for a certain amount of time, but certainly by George W. Bush, the greatest threat to the international rules-based order, as some people call it in Washington, was the United States, the country that was nominally the guarantor of it. And if the American hegemony declines, then, and it's replaced by China, you still have the Chiles, you still have the EU, you still have Canada, you still have New Zealand, you still have Japan, you still have Singapore, you still have South Korea, you may not have Taiwan. And you still have those international agreements and organizations that temper the conduct of global affairs. The question is, can they be durable with hegemon as brutal and ruthless as the PRC? Well, I'd argue they survived the hegemon as brutal and ruthless as the United States. So I see an actually more optimistic outcome where it's possible that simply due to imperial convenience, for the sake of the exercise of power by the PRC, these institutions left over, inherited from the United States, are taken up in a similar way to the United States in terms of their use. These are rules that you can force on other countries and use your power to temper, second, third country relations that don't concern you, while as hegemon, you reserve the right of exception, that you are above the laws that you enforce on others, which seems to me, as a Canadian, something of a lateral move. That the situation may not be that different. Of course, please.
I'm not interrupting, but I want to catch your point before you shift, because you're kind of on a roll. Okay. So what's the difference between China as a global hegemon and the United States or Britain? Okay. Why is there some critical aspect of it? Okay. First of all, China is the first global hegemon to emerge in the succession from the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, and the United States. It didn't participate in this painful discussion, this continuous development of these ideas of human rights.
I would actually challenge that, but please go on.
Okay. For 5 centuries, they were outside that debate. But second, the adoption of these principles and their evolution is not exclusively or even primarily the work of states. Okay, they're a result of civil society pressure. In the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, it was the role of the missionary friars, the religious orders, which were, if you will, kind of an institutionalization of civil society. In the case of the British, it was the non-conforming religious sects, the Quakers, the Methodists, and then evangelicals within the established Anglican Church that launched a multi-decade debate during the late 18th century when Britain absolutely dominated the slave trade, branding the slave trade as immoral. And that debate culminated in Parliament in 1807, abolishing the slave trade, which was a source of enormous wealth for the United Kingdom. That was such a There were petitions signed by over 1 million people in a society of 10 million people. Okay, it was an enormous effort to mount that. It was a citizens' crusade against the powers, the aristocracy that had money from the Caribbean plantations, the city of London that had capital from it, the shipping and all the rest. Okay, it was a citizens' revolt against what was determined to be something manifestly evil. And as a result of that, the British Royal Navy spent the better part of 80 years as its primary mission, the extirpation of the Atlantic slave trade. The United Kingdom spent 2% of its gross national product on the extirpation of the slave trade. 15,000 British sailors died in that campaign. And the slave trade was so profitable right up to the very end that it took the American Civil War and 750,000 deaths to extirpate it in this country. And it took the world's greatest imperial power, indeed, the unchallenged global hegemon, to lend its most powerful instrument, the Royal Navy, and much of its wealth and resources, its sort of surplus. 2% doesn't sound like very much, but that's actually an enormous amount of a surplus, okay, in the extirpation of this trade, all right? And the same thing, now, when the United Nations was established, okay, originally there was a conference in a place called Dumbarton Oaks outside Washington, and the club of powers got together, Soviet, British, American representatives, and they drew up a draft charter for the United Nations, and basically they created the Security Council as the place where the power would reside, with 5 permanent members, okay, who would always be on the Security Council and who had a veto. Every one of them had a veto. So they had the power of blocking this international organization from doing something. And then FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said, oh, and we'll have a General Assembly so the little countries can get together every year and blow off steam. In other words, this was supposed to be an imperial club. When that treaty went to San Francisco, 2 things happened. The Latin American republics met privately. You mentioned the Chiles and all the rest. They met privately beforehand, and they came with an agenda to shift this power away from the Security Council and to make an empowered General Assembly. And then also, there were dozens of civil society groups that turned up. The B'nai B'rith, the Jewish Human Rights Organization, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the original African-American civil rights organization. And they lobbied intensely for the enshrining of human rights in the UN Charter and collectively shifting the character of the UN to transform it from an imperial club into the basis of a genuine international community. Now, okay, so what has China got for civil society? It is a very powerful dictatorship, which, because of the famous firewall, the great firewall of China, are cut off from international debate and discourse, and have an extremely efficient and ruthless police apparatus that crushes any kind of dissent. And their, crushing of Uyghur identity, incarcerating 1 million people in those camps in China to extirpate that ethnic and religious identity, is a demonstration of the extraordinary power of this dictatorship to crush civil society. So the play between civil society representing principles and ideals and the state representing power and coming together to shape this international order, China's not going to do that, okay? China will not do that. China has this very ruthless communist dictatorship, arguably the most powerful dictatorship in human history.
If I may,
Sure.
I think that that's all very well taken, and I
thought it was real clever
you're right.
myself, actually.
Sorry, I don't mean to sound contentious. The issue what I see is that China has its own, the People's Republic of China has its own internal dynamics, which go beyond totalitarian state and oppressed, brutalized individuals. There's in the Soviet Union too, you had periods of high to more intense totalitarianism and periods of relative thaw. In China, although the situation now is more severe than it has been in the past in terms of the pressure placed on dissidents, control of the media, there's also a huge Chinese diaspora, movement of Chinese in and out of China. There's the reason that the apparatus of control needs to be so robust is precisely because there are so many avenues in which discussion, debate, person-to-person disagreement with the regime are possible. The Chinese People's Republic is not entirely outside of the trajectory of Western modernity either. It was the Communist Party that effectively put an end to foot binding, to polygamy, to the slavery of the peasantry in Tibet under lamaseries. There is a element of the human rights tradition that was inherited by the PRC through communism, through Soviet socialism. And it is debased, no question. And it is imperfect. One could argue the same for the American civil rights tradition, frankly. And I think that my hope, I'm not an optimist about the future, and I think many of your most pessimistic projections in the book are sadly going to be borne out in time for us to see them. But to the extent that I have hope for mitigating the consequences of things like climate change, it precisely comes from the potential of the PRC to act rationally in its own interests, to take into account the human considerations of its own populations, which are an element of the governability of its own state. Its concern for what other countries, for its ability to project authority and not just domination, if and when it becomes a hegemon, that I think the most survival course for the world isn't a deal that comes out of the United States, but one in which the non-American countries of the West are able to negotiate with China to make a governable world which nonetheless includes the legacy of human rights and the international rule of law, which I think is intelligible to even the Communist Party of China, which behaves as it does out of significant real threats to its own authority and security. So
let me talk about what I see as the emerging duality within the emerging Chinese world order, such as we can discern it, because it's taking shape. And I think it goes to much of what you're saying. On the idea of principle and idea, if you look at Xi Jinping's statements and the statement of Chinese officials about what they're doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, okay, on the one hand, they're very serious about this. They argue that China has lifted 60 million of its own people out of absolute misery and poverty through urbanization and economic development, and indeed they have. There has been a transformation of the fabric of life for most people in China. And what they're arguing is that they're extending that uplift, that economic progress, to the world's forgotten, not just millions, but you could say the world's forgotten hundreds of millions. Admittedly, during the period of the US-led international order, the most extreme poverty, people living on less than $1 a day, that has been grossly reduced, but poverty, people living on less than $5 a day, still remains in the hundreds of millions. And China is addressing itself. And when you think about when the Cold War came to an end, the U.S. aggressive development program, where we were giving fairly heavy foreign aid and had a bureaucracy that, along with the World Bank and the Europeans and all the rest was actually trying to improve state capacity among newly emerging nations, uplift the quality of life. Well, when the Cold War came to an end, and we went to this neoliberal economic model of pure free market economics, we kind of forgot about that. I mean, sure, we kept having a little bit of foreign aid around the margins. Okay, so what China has done with its wealth, China was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001. It became very quickly, within 15 years, the workshop of the world. Its trade with the United States went up fivefold, and its foreign exchange went from $200 million in foreign exchange reserves in about 2001 to $4 trillion by 2014. And it's launched this Belt and Road Initiative, which is a $1.2 trillion program extending aid mainly to Eurasia, development program in human history. At the end of World War II, as we all know, and I discussed this in the book, the U.S. Marshall Plan was designed to reconstruct a ravaged and starving Europe, and that was at the time $13 million, which, if you correct for inflation, is about $100 billion today. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is 12 times that. There's been nothing like it, right? And it has sufficient power to really lay down infrastructure and create the capacity to uplift these forgotten hundreds of millions from poverty. Because there's also the mobilization of local funds and international funds that come along with it. And yes, that's very real. Okay, that's the idealistic side. And by the way, I'm personally rather annoyed at the way when the mainstream US press covers the Belt and Road Initiative. They call it debt colonialism. They talk about these white elephant projects like airports in countries that aren't being fully used, etc. If you spend $1.2 trillion working with developing nations that have limited state capacity, you're going to, and corruption, you're going to have problems. There's going to be some graft at the edges. There's no doubt that's going to occur. But let's look at the main event. This is enormous. This is unprecedented. In human history, there's never been anything close to this, all right? Okay, so that's the principle.
And at the heart of Eurasia, too.
And Africa.
Africa as well, yeah.
I mean, China has been China's first serious international aid project at the time that we were.
Tanzania Railroad.
Yeah, the Tanzan Railroad, right? And it was designed to liberate Zambia and the producing nations of Africa from the stranglehold of having to ship their products to market through South Africa, which was then apartheid and a real force of oppression in Southern Africa. Yeah, we regard we regard Africa as kind of a charity case. We have the Gates Foundation helping out and all that. It's China regards Africa as a serious economic partner, and it has for nearly a half century, right?
Mao, essentially.
Yeah, since 1970. Okay, it's actually been 50 years that they've been seriously involved in the economic development of Africa and building close and effective working relations with the liberation movements, which are now the governments of Africa. Okay, so yes, that's very serious. Okay, then there's the power side of the duality. All right, by trading, and China is, by international human rights organizations, regarded as the international rubric of humans, that China is damaging the rights structure that these people, these forgotten hundreds of millions, are going to need as they rise out of misery. And second, China is propagating coal-fired power transnationally at an extraordinary level, so that they are participating in the pollution of the atmosphere, the global warming. China itself domestically, that drive for development also involved massive coal mining and coal-fired electrical power. China now accounts by itself for 30% of all the emissions. And if you add up all the coal-fired plants that China's got online, the world is backing away from coal and China is promoting it. I mean, by themselves, they are probably up to something like 40% of all global greenhouse emissions, right? Now, the cruel irony, as far as China is concerned, is that China, I think, is going to emerge as the global hegemon around about 2030.
Just in time for climate catastrophe.
Well, no, not quite.
20 years,
things are getting,
20 years ahead of climate catastrophe.
If you look at the projections, and one of the things I did in that final chapter of my book is I read the climate science. The climate science is very predictive, okay? They run things out to the end of the century, and they have various scenarios for whether it's going to be a high damage or medium damage or low, and they're very scientific in their calculations.
I've seen studies which have all of those scenarios, and the low damage ones are all blacked out because they're technically possible, but practically unrealizable due to political and institutional constraints.
Right. Okay. So when you take the mid to upper levels, which is what I do, I always go pessimistic on when I use the projections.
It's entirely correct.
Yeah, and you overlay on top of that the trajectory of world history, the fate of empires. What you see is the following: is that significant and gathering disruption up to 2030, but that doesn't impinge upon the economic forces that are going to make China the great global hegemon. PricewaterhouseCoopers, the global accounting firm, has predicted by 2030 the Chinese economy at $38 trillion will be over 50% larger than the US economy. And since the two powers, the United States and China, spend roughly 2 and 3% of their gross domestic product on military, well, if China's economy is 50% larger than ours, inevitably their military
transition is inevitable, but it will happen shortly before the entire focus of China and the rest of the planet will have to be addressing the reality of climate catastrophe.
Well, China is going to get a double whammy like nobody else. Okay.
Wet bulb
The
temperatures.
science says
Shanghai.
The first thing, as I said in the book, is that by 2050, Shanghai, surrounding urban area, is going to be underwater. Shanghai was dredged from swamp and sea starting in the 15th century, and the scientific calculations are pretty clear that the greatest economic engine of Shanghai is going to be heavily damaged. Then there's the North China Plain, Beijing, and it's the agriculture and industrial heartland of China. It's now home to 400 million people, something like a third of China's population. By 2060, 2070, if not earlier, China, that North China Plain is going to become one of the least habitable places on the planet, arguably the least habitable. They're going to have hundreds of extreme weather events, and they're going to have, it's estimated by a study led by a team from MIT, that they're going to have at least 5 events of 35-degree wet bulb temperature. Now, what does that mean? 35 degrees centigrade wet bulb temperature. That's when the heat and humidity come together in a way that the human body is unable to sweat. And a healthy adult at rest, seated in 35-degree wet bulb temperature, is dead in 6 hours. Okay? It's just a biological fact. So North China is going to be this disaster area. Shanghai is going to be the water. China's era as global hegemon will be over. They will be forced to retreat from the world and use their resources to save their own people. And that's the cruelty of China's rush, its extraordinary rush, economic development and prosperity.
I want to continue, and I
Well,
have.
well, yeah. Before you continue, because Alfred said he could only stay with us for an hour, and it's been an hour and 15 minutes because the conversation
very
got so
ungracious.
spicy.
Well, okay. Let me finish on one note, okay, for the listeners.
Okay.
Okay, so where are we in 2050? U.S. global power is faded. The liberal world order that the United States was the handmaiden of is going to be battered a bit as the great global hegemon is fade, retreating from the world, turning inward. So where are we? And I think actually that there's that things are going to get so bad as they, as we've seen with the California wildfires, the Australian wildfires. What's interesting is that climate denial has kind of gone away. Nobody's, except for crackpots, are talking about that anymore. Okay, and so we're actually starting to engage the climate crisis with some seriousness, both at home and abroad, because of these early disasters. Well, as it gets worse, and it's going to get very bad by 2050, okay, the world is going to, again, not just have conferences and chat about things and have voluntary emission standards. We're going to have to think about really changing the nature of the world order, moving away with kind of the amorphous, sort of astructural system that we have now into a formal world order in which the nations of the world will agree to cede limited areas, but critical areas of sovereignty to kind of a supranational government, which would probably be the UN. And this cession of sovereignty and authority would come in three critical areas. First, just as right now the international community regards military aggression, crossing your border, invading another country, as a violation of international law. And that regarded as a similar transgression. And so a nation that has not converted to renewable energy and they continue to release CO2 in the atmosphere and methane in the atmosphere will be compelled by the threat of sanctions to switch to renewable energy. Second thing that's going to happen is humanity. The climate science indicates now that by 2050, this time when China is fading, there will be between 200 million and 1.2 billion climate change refugees uprooted from their precarious perches on battered seashores and floodplains and desert fringe, which are aridifying. And these people are going to be in motion not because they want a better life or something. No, it's simply because they want to survive. They have to move to survive. And we saw what happened between 2016 and 2018 when there were refugee flows showing up at the southern border of the European Union and of the United States. That led to Britain's Brexit, the rise of ultranationalism, angry ultranationalists, anti-immigrant populists in Europe, and that's still going on. And then the election of Donald Trump and his build the wall call here in the United States. And when you add up the Africans crossing the Mediterranean, the Middle Easterners coming from Turkey to the Greek islands, and the Central Americans coming to the US border, that was just 2 million people. Just 2 million people produced that reaction. Well, what happens when it's 200 million? Or maybe getting up to 1 billion people? It's unimaginable. So we're going to need an international government to have a rational resettlement of these people, a kind of empowered and larger UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And that nations in the temperate zone will, from 35 degrees north latitude to 55 degrees north latitude, which is going to be the habitable part of the earth, are going to have to accept a quota of resettled human beings. Third thing, and this was already talked about at the UN conference in Glasgow a few weeks ago, and that's the idea of the systematic transfer of resources, technology and capital from the prosperous, temperate, industrial world to the tropical world that is battered by, first of all, the loss of agriculture and food security with the rise of hunger, and second of all, a need to have climate change remediation to allow their populations to survive. And so when you add up these three things, what we're going to be moving towards is a really, for the first time in human history, an empowered global governance. Because the alternative is a uncontrollable eruption of conflict over water and refugees and horrors beyond imagining. Brutal, primordial conflict over land and people and water and food, in every quarter of the globe. And it will be an irrational and bloody way of sorting out the diminishing resources. And so the world will need a rational system for managing this to minimize the suffering and maximize the possibility of cooperation. And so it's kind of, in a way, hopeful that we can change.
Well, thank you.
Those
maybe so
are coming from Dr. Alfred McCoy. He has a new book out, To Govern the Globe. Wherever you're watching this show, there should be links in the description to the book. Thank you again, Al, for coming on and spending some time with us. I definitely appreciate you staying over. I was watching that clock real hard, and then when the conversation got thick, I was like, oh, well, I'll just shut up and see how long it goes for. So thank you very much for staying on with us for about almost 90 minutes.
And I want to thank you guys for challenging me, because, not just sitting there and asking, kind of Dorothy Diggs questions and saying, oh, terrific, and next question. I mean, engaging me and forcing me to defend my positions, because this is a much more interesting conversation than it might have been otherwise. We brought out some...
My pleasure, sir. My pleasure.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. That was terrific. I really enjoyed that. You guys pushed me. You pushed me. I mean, I thought my book says a lot, and it does actually say a lot.
Yeah.
It took me 15
You wrote
years.
500 some pages of a lot.
Yeah, well, it's actually about 400. Let's give the readers a break here, folks. It's not Sunday morning on the TV. It's only 400 pages, and it reads pretty well.
Honestly,
it does read. It is an easy read. Easy in the sense of it's not a super academic book where it's hard to read and hard to follow. It is a very easy read. It's extremely easy to follow. A ton of history, great scholarship in the book. Even there's some things that we may not agree with 100%. I definitely think the book is very, very informative and an important read.
Good. Thank you, guys.
If it weren't so valuable, I wouldn't have bothered pushing. But you capture so much essential facts about the condition that we're in that I just want to be part of that discussion. And thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, guys. This was a great experience. Much appreciated.
All right. And on that note, guys, Kuba and I are going to hurry up into the after hours, and we are out.